Tonight, I want to share a story about a human choice, one that lingered far longer than I expected. The late afternoon light was fading, casting long shadows across Henry's workshop. The air smelled of damp earth, cedar shavings, and the sharp tang of copper wire. Henry was a man of quiet routines. A retired structural engineer, he had traded the noise of steel and deadlines for the slow patience of bonsai. His house had been filled with silence ever since his wife, Martha, passed 3 years ago. Now he stood before a workbench that felt more like an altar than a workspace. His calloused hands hovered over a Japanese white pine he had been shaping for a decade. Yet tonight his heart raced. In less than an hour, the daughter he hadn't spoken to in 5 years would walk through the door. He adjusted his glasses, focusing on the tree. He told himself the trembling in his fingers was just age, not the fear of a conversation he had rehearsed 1,000 times, but never had. The pine was resilient, twisted and contorted, living in a pot far too shallow for its majesty. Henry picked up concave cutters, the cold steel grounding him. A branch had grown too thick, threatening the tree's balance. As he worked, he saw the irony. He had spent decades controlling these trees, yet failed to nurture the growth of the only family left to him. There's a bonsai technique called gene. Bark is stripped from a branch to create stark white deadwood, a scar of survival. To outsiders, it looks like a flaw, but to Henry, it was the soul of the tree. He ran his thumb over the smooth white wood and thought of the fight with his daughter, the harsh words that stripped their relationship bare, leaving a scar that never healed. A piece of deadwood between them, impossible to ignore. Henry set down the tool. Outside, the autumn wind tore leaves from the maples. A violent, necessary shedding. Sarah had called yesterday. Her voice was thin and brittle, stripped of the youthful defiance he remembered. She simply asked if she could come home. He hadn't asked why, hadn't asked about her husband or life 300 miles away. He just said yes. Now that yes weighed on him like a winter coat he wasn't sure he could wear. Could a father who didn't know how to speak to his own child ever really be a home again? The crunch of a car on gravel pulled him from thought, a sound so foreign it made him flinch. Instinctively, he grabbed a rag, as if he could wipe away years of distance along with the sap and dirt. Henry didn't move at first. A wave of inadequacy paralyzed him. He looked around the workshop, tools, soil, wire, silent trees, and felt his life had shrunk. Too small, too microscopic. He had focused on tiny worlds while the real one spun out of orbit. He inhaled the scent of damp soil, usually calming. Today, it smelled like stagnation. He forced his feet to move, dragging them across the floorboards. He left the sanctuary of the workshop and stepped into the hallway. The silence here was heavy, waiting for a voice he wasn't sure he'd recognize anymore. The door opened just as she reached for the bell. For a moment, they froze, framed by gray light. Two strangers, same eyes, same stubborn jaw. Sarah looked older, tired in a way sleep couldn't fix. Her coat too thin, a small suitcase in hand, holding what seemed like everything she owned. Henry felt a physical ache, wanting to pull her in, yet trapped by years of solitude that had hardened around him like bark. She gave a hesitant smile, barely reaching her eyes. "Hi, Dad." The words sounded rusty and used for a long time. Henry forgot all his speeches. He simply stepped back, opened the door wider, and gestured for her to come inside. Redemption, he realized, started not with an apology, but by making space. They moved to the kitchen. Too large, too empty. Ghosts of past dinners lingered in corners. Henry busied himself with the kettle, needing a task to bridge the gap. The rush of water and click of the stove filled the silence. Sarah sat at the table, hands wrapped around themselves. Her eyes scanned the room, dusty picture frames, stacks of unread mail. A man who had stopped engaging with the world. She cleared her throat. "How's the garden?" A safe topic, neutral ground. Henry felt gratitude that she hadn't begun with the heavy stuff. He spoke of the maples turning early this year, a mundane fact, yet a lifeline across a chasm. The kettle whistled, shattering the tension. Henry poured water into 2 mismatched mugs. Steam rose between them, a veil obscuring her face. She blew on her tea, curling the vapor around her fingers, then whispered that she had left her husband. It was over. She felt she had failed at the one thing she'd promised herself she'd get right. Henry felt protective anger, not at her, but for her. Then a crushing helplessness. He was an engineer of structures, of trees, not human hearts. No blueprint existed for this. He stood, hands useless at his sides. He sat opposite her. The chair creaked. Words of comfort stuck in his throat. Failure wasn't final. He had failed her mother, failed Sarah by letting her go. But fear blocked him. Instead, he reached for the sugar bowl and pushed it toward her. She used to like her tea sweet. A small gesture, almost insignificant, but also a test. Did she still remember the man who made her pancakes on Sunday mornings? She stirred her tea, the rhythmic clink soothing. "I don't want to talk yet," she said. "I just need somewhere quiet, somewhere that doesn't demand anything." Henry nodded, understanding completely. That was exactly what he had built in his workshop, a sanctuary from the noise of the world. "Come with me," he said suddenly, standing before he could overthink it. If they stayed in the kitchen, weighed down by memories, they'd suffocate. Sarah looked surprised but stood, leaving her suitcase by the door. They walked down the hallway, through the back door, across the yard. The air shifted from the house's sterile warmth to the greenhouse's humid breath. He opened the door for her. The smell of damp earth hit them. She relaxed slightly, shoulders dropping. Here, time moved with the growth of branches. Mistakes weren't judged. They were pruned, redirected. She walked the rows, fingers brushing wooden benches, eyes tracing twisted trunks and floating foliage. She stopped before a juniper easily 300 years old, collected from the mountains and trained in a pot. Her gaze fixed on the stark white deadwood, the gene. "Why didn't you cut it off?" she asked softly, tone heavier than the tree alone could explain. Henry stepped beside her. "Without the deadwood, the tree is just a bush," he said. "The struggle it endured gives it character. You can't erase a living thing's history without taking away its value." Tears glimmered in her eyes. He knew she saw her own scars, the failed marriage, the 5 years of silence, the fear of being broken beyond repair. He thought of Nabari, the surface roots of a tree, the anchor that keeps it upright. A tree with weak Nabari topples, no matter how strong the branches. He realized he had focused on the branches of his life, career, pride, principles, while neglecting the roots, the connection to family that kept him grounded. "I didn't think you'd still be doing this," she whispered, gesturing to the hundreds of trees. Henry picked up a brush for cleaning bark, turning it in his hands. After her mother died, these trees were the only things that didn't pity him. The only things that needed him without demanding words he didn't have. He looked at her. Her Nabari, her roots, had been pulled from the soil of life. She swayed in the wind, afraid of falling. He decided then his job wasn't styling the tree anymore. It was repacking the soil around the roots, holding her steady until she could stand on her own. He moved to a workstation, pulled out a stool, patted the seat. He handed her a pair of shears without a word, not as a guest, but as an apprentice to the moment. She looked at the sharp tool with trepidation, shaking her head, saying she would ruin it, that she didn't know what she was doing, that she destroyed things, she didn't fix them. Henry gently took her hand, his rough skin against her smooth palm, and wrapped her fingers around the handle, telling her that you can't ruin a tree by making a choice. You only ruin it by neglecting it, by refusing to make any choice at all. And he pointed to a small elm tree that needed pruning, a messy, overgrown thing that was full of chaotic energy, much like the emotions swirling in the room between them. "Just cut the branches that cross each other," he instructed softly, his voice dropping to the quiet register he used when he was talking to the trees themselves, guiding her hand to a specific branch that was rubbing against another, causing a wound in the bark. Sarah hesitated, the blades hovering over the wood, her breath catching in her throat, the fear of making a permanent mistake paralyzing her, mirroring the paralysis that had kept her away for 5 years. Henry didn't rush her, he didn't take the shears back. He simply stood there as a solid presence, a windbreak against her storm, waiting for her to trust herself enough to make the cut, understanding that this wasn't about the branch. It was about the agency she had lost and needed to reclaim. Snip! The sound was crisp and final, the small branch falling to the bench. And Sarah let out a breath she seemed to have been holding since she walked in the door, her shoulders relaxing as she saw that the tree didn't die, it didn't collapse, it just looked a little bit cleaner, a little bit more open to the light. She looked at Henry, a small spark of pride in her eyes, and he nodded, a silent affirmation that she had done good, that she was capable, that the world didn't end when you let something go. They worked in silence for a while, the rhythm of the snipping filling the greenhouse, a conversation spoken in actions rather than words, the pile of discarded branches growing on the table, representing the clutter, and the noise that they were slowly, methodically clearing away from their relationship. As the sun began to set, casting a deep orange glow through the glass panels of the roof, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Henry went to the back of the greenhouse and retrieved a pot he had been saving, a beautiful, unglazed ceramic rectangle that was deep and sturdy. He brought it to the bench and placed it next to the tree Sarah had been pruning, and he told her that sometimes a tree gets pot-bound, where the roots circle around the inside of the container, choking themselves, unable to take in new nutrients because they are trapped in their own history. He explained that the only way to save it is to take it out, comb out the tangled roots, trim away what is dead or rotting, and give it fresh soil, a new environment where it has room to stretch out and breathe again. Sarah looked at the pot, then at her father, her eyes filling with a fresh wave of tears. But these were different. They weren't the tears of despair she had shed earlier, but the tears of being seen, of being understood without having to explain the gory details of her pain. "I'm pot-bound, Dad," she whispered, her voice cracking, the confession hanging in the air like a fragile leaf. And Henry felt his heart break and heal in the same instant, realizing that she wasn't just his daughter anymore. She was a fellow traveler, a human being struggling with the confines of her life. He put his arm around her shoulders, pulling her into his side, smelling the rain on her hair and the faint scent of the tea they had shared, and he held her while she cried, standing as firm and unmoving as the oak tree in the front yard, letting her storms wash over him without wavering. He told her that they would repot her life, starting tomorrow, that there was no rush, that trees grow in seasons, not in hours, and that she could stay as long as she needed to find her new shape. He explained that the wire used in bonsai to bend branches isn't meant to be permanent, it's just a guide, a temporary structure to hold the branch in a new position until the wood hardens and learns to hold itself there, and that his role now was just to be the wire. Sarah leaned her head on his shoulder, the sobbing subsiding into quiet hiccups, and for the first time in 5 years, Henry felt the house, and his heart wasn't empty, but full of potential, full of the messy, complicated, beautiful work of being alive. Night had fully fallen outside, the greenhouse now lit only by the small work lamp over the bench, creating a pool of warmth in the darkness, a small island of safety where the rest of the world couldn't touch them. Henry began to clean the tools, wiping the sap from the blades with a rhythmic, meditative motion, showing Sarah how to care for the things that care for you, passing on a legacy of respect and maintenance that was far more valuable than any inheritance. She watched him, her eyes heavy with exhaustion but clear, and she picked up a broom to sweep the floor, joining him in the ritual of closing down the day, a small domestic act that felt like a treaty, a promise that they were in this together now. As they walked back to the house, the cold air stinging their cheeks, Henry stopped to look up at the stars, which were brilliant and sharp in the autumn sky, and he pointed out the constellations to her like he used to when she was a child, connecting the dots of light in the vast darkness. He realized that for years he had been looking down at his trees, focusing on the microscopic details, obsessing over the flaw in a single leaf, and he had forgotten to look up, to see the vastness of the universe and his small place within it. Sarah looked up too, her breath pluming in the air, and she took his arm, linking her elbow through his, a physical connection that grounded him to the earth more effectively than any root system ever could. Inside the house, the kitchen was still warm, the mugs sitting on the table where they had left them, artifacts of the awkward beginning of the evening. But now the space felt different, charged with a quiet possibility. Henry opened the fridge and found the ingredients for a simple meal, eggs and toast, the comfort food of their shared past, and as he cracked the eggs into the pan, the sizzle sounded like applause, a celebration of the mundane. Sarah sat at the table, not checking her phone, not looking at the door, but watching him cook, her presence filling the room, and Henry realized that he wasn't just making dinner, he was making a memory, laying down a new layer of soil for them to grow into. They ate in a comfortable silence, the kind that doesn't need to be filled with chatter, the kind that exists between two people who know the worst about each other and choose to stay anyway. Henry watched his daughter eat, noticing the return of a little color to her cheeks, the relaxing of the lines around her mouth, and he felt a profound sense of gratitude. Not just that she was here, but that he had been given a second chance to be a father, a role he thought he had retired from along with his engineering job. He thought about the gene on the pine tree again, the deadwood that made it beautiful, and he realized that the 5 years of silence were their gene, the scar that would always be part of their story. But it didn't have to define the future growth. After dinner, Sarah washed the dishes and Henry dried, a choreography they fell back into as if no time had passed, the clinking of china and the rush of water the only music they needed. She asked him if he would teach her more about the trees tomorrow, if she could help him with the repotting he had planned for the spring, and Henry felt a lump form in his throat, a swell of emotion that was purely restorative. He told her he would teach her everything he knew, promising her not just his knowledge, but his time, the most precious resource he had, realizing that the trees could wait, that they operated on a timeline of centuries. But his daughter was here now, and she was the only living thing that truly mattered. They said goodnight at the foot of the stairs, the same spot where she had shouted at him 5 years ago. The echo of that old anger finally silenced by the quiet grace of the evening. Sarah hugged him, a fierce, tight embrace that knocked the wind out of him, burying her face in his sweater that smelled of the greenhouse, and whispered, "Thank you, Dad," words that healed the last of the fractures in his heart. Henry held her, resting his chin on the top of her head, closing his eyes, and simply breathing in the moment, storing it away against the coming winter, knowing that this warmth would sustain him long after she went to sleep. He waited until he heard her bedroom door click shut, the sound of safety, before he went around the house turning off the lights, checking the locks, performing the rituals of the protector he had always wanted to be. He walked back into the living room and sat in his armchair, the house settling around him, but the silence was no longer empty. It was pregnant with the promise of tomorrow, with the knowledge that there was someone upstairs sleeping under his roof. He looked at the bonsai he had brought inside earlier, the pine with the white scar, and he nodded to it, a silent acknowledgement between two survivors. Henry realized then that redemption isn't a flash of lightning or a grand gesture. It is the quiet, daily decision to nurture something, to water the roots even when you can't see the growth, to strip away the bark and expose the wood and find the beauty in the damage. He knew that the winter would be hard, that there would be difficult conversations and setbacks, that Sarah's healing would be slow and uneven, just like the growth of his trees. But he also knew, with the certainty of a man who has watched seasons turn for 60 years, that spring always comes, that the sap always rises, and that as long as the roots are deep, the tree will stand. This is a quiet voice. A quiet voice sharing a human story. Good night.